I was going to make this the final video in my series about culture and nature and politics and spirituality. The thing is, spirituality hasn't really entered into this discussion. In fact, it's been kind of, as the cliche has it, conspicuous by its absence. And I may make a video after this to kind of emphasize just why we cannot find political solutions to the problems that our society is facing. Quick recap here, and I thought as a way of explaining how it is that mainstream culture goes awry, it occurred to me that the British in the 19th century in India were, and this carries us back to Rudyard Kipling and the white man's burden, and in some ways that rather racist mentality had something noble about it, something self-sacrificial, the idea of doing for other people who can't do for themselves. The native East Indians practiced farming methods that exhausted their soil so that they would have these periodic famines and thousands would die. So the British brought greater sophistication about farming. The native Indians would practice this custom called sati, where the widows of a man who just died, especially if he were of high social status, would be expected to throw themselves into the funeral pyre and burn themselves up along with him. And the British absolutely suppressed that, and they should have. Here's an example of a culture that a Judeo-Christian Western culture that was founded on moral inspiration that was quite enlightening. And that culture attempted to shine its light on other cultures around the world. But the problem is that, again, the light that we access from within as individuals, and hopefully we're able to beam back out into our culture, becomes transmitted by that culture to future individuals as a kind of almost cliquish, tribal, well, you're one of us, this is your inheritance. It's no longer a thing that comes from within. So when people bear this better culture out into the world, they have a kind of arrogance about them that leads them to ruthlessly oppress other less progressive, more primitive cultures. And the people in the victim cultures may actually be quite inhumanely treated, as was the case of many Indians who fell under the British Raj. Then subsequent generations, and we certainly have seen this in the British in Western Europe. The British, after World War II, pulled out of India so very quickly. I think Lord Mountbatten was given 90 days. And the British were so self-conscious of the moral excesses of their empire that they just turned their back and ran and created a situation where the Pakistani Muslims and the Indian Hindus were fighting with each other, and millions of people died as the Muslims ran for the two Pakistans that were 1,000 miles apart. It was an insane solution that was a non-solution that was created by the British guilt over the 2 centuries of their abusive Raj in India. And then, and this is happening in our country, in the United States, and I think there's a kind of almost a fatality to this. It seems as though there's a sort of, if there are laws in history, this is following a pattern where mainstream cultures that have a certain moral enlightenment originally go into this late phase where they're aware of their excesses and they yield to minority cultures which are perhaps less enlightened but have people within them who have been somewhat brutalized in the past. And so the mainstream culture is now sort of flagellating itself. It's hands off. It's yielding. It's allowing itself to be walked all over by minority cultures, And this is kind of where I have come up to this point in these videos, that minority cultures are used by progressives within the once mainstream culture. This gets kind of interesting. Uh, the counterculture, as we called it back in the 60s, the enemies of culture, people who identify with Marxism, with progressivism, with science as they see it, with what I've called the idolatry of the future. We're going to make a perfect world and it's going to be constructed just out of human reason. Those people will use minority cultures and use the mainstream culture's guilt to lever the majority culture right out of the picture. So majority customs and habits vanish in this sort of meltdown. The minorities, the subcultures are the solvent that destroys the mainstream. And the end game for the utopians, the progressives, is to finally mop up the solvent. That means the subcultures too. There is no culture of any sort at the end of the day except reason, science, progress. And that's not going to change. In the minds of the utopians, that will never change, because how can you argue with reason? We've figured this out. We have the right answers for everything. There's no reason why our culture would ever have to change, because the world has just been waiting for us to appear. We're the guys who, we have science, we've figured this all out. So everything from now on is going to be the way we say it. You could, in different terms, I've already said I haven't been introducing the spiritual into this discussion very much, but from a spiritual perspective, you could say that this is the ultimate objective of the counterculture, which is it's a culture. There's no such thing as a human society that doesn't have a culture. The counterculture itself is going to create this culture of what they call reason, which is a pyramid with themselves on the top, dictating to everyone below them. But that's the objective, to put themselves on God's throne. God no longer exists. God is irrational. Those were stupid, superstitious ideas from the past. There's no God, but there's reason, and there's science and progress, and we'll tell you where those will lead you. So now the utopians are God, and their ideology is the gospel. In this respect, it's kind of interesting, again, that Judeo-Christianity and Islam, if you want to look at the struggles that are going on in our own society, they're actually, or they could be, allies. I don't think they perceive themselves as allies, but at any rate, everyone who believes in any kind of God is ultimately going to be the target of the progressive utopian, because the state with science and reason is the new God, the only true God. So minority cultures too, they may be the last ones to go to the guillotine, but they're all going to be swept aside. And this is where I wanted to go with this particular video. This is not a recommendation. It's not a kind of programmatic suggestion. I'm not offering you any sort of plan. I don't think our society is likely to do this in any effective or coherent way. I'm just saying that it must be. This is what I see as the necessary result. Either we have the reign of the elite, the enlightened, scientistic, rationalist utopians. Either we have that, and that's going to be a very oppressive tyranny, because there's nothing more oppressive than somebody who has all the answers, and these people have all the answers. They are God. Either we have that, or we have a kind of balkanization of different cultures. That's not a very happy prospect either, is it? But it's kind of what they call Hobson's choice. You know, you can have strychnine or cyanide, take your pick. But I think that would actually be the preferable choice, just to have a society that dissolves into pockets of different culture. If we could just have our separate cultures leaving each other alone, now they're going to have clear, distinct physical boundaries. We're already seeing, interestingly, in our culture, the left doing this with sanctuary cities. It's odd, isn't it, that in practice, the notion of secession, and although the left doesn't invoke the 10th Amendment, it's really a 10th Amendment idea. It's states' rights. The idea of walling yourself out, walling yourself off from the mainstream that you hate so much because they are so oppressive and they don't accept your progressive ideas. That's kind of an inside-out deployment of secession and the 10th Amendment. And we're going to have to apply those ideas just universally in the United States. We're going to have to create pockets, and maybe the physical divisions will be cities or entire states, but we will have to disagree, and stay on our side of the boundary if we're going to have harmony in the future. And again, I'm not recommending this. I think it's really sad that things have reached this pass, but I don't see any realistic way that we survive without this. Perhaps if there's any harmony that remains after this balkanization, people will be able to vote with their feet if they decide they don't like, if a Muslim wants to be a more liberal Muslim and not live under Sharia and go and live in the Judaeo-Christian freer society, then he or she can, as they say, you can vote with your feet. And hopefully we'll have some provision where people who don't actually like living in that culture, although they were born into it, can join the other culture. That would be the best outcome. And we also would, hopefully, this would be my hope, that there will be a sort of environment where individuals can, if you want, air quotes again, preach the gospel. I don't necessarily mean that in a strictly Christian sense, but individuals can broadcast their individual vision of the light, the truth, and people can hear them on the other side of the cultural dividing line, and if they like what they hear, they can come on over. The power of culture is really, and the proper, just, valid power of culture is in its individuals who speak for its fundamental moral values. It's, again, not in the tanks and in the takeovers, the colonization, the imperialism. And maybe we can have eloquent individuals who win others over to come to our side. But if we don't have physical boundaries, and if we don't respect those boundaries and allow people on opposite sides to practice their way of life unmolested, if we keep trying to invade each other culturally and use the political system to do that, we'll have no political system with any freedom, where we will eventually, because again, this is the end game of the progressive elite, we will have a dictatorship of a bunch of know-it-all self-made gods. And I sure hope I don't live to see that, and I hope you don't either.